Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about the recent drawdown in price for Fantom and what we might want to make of that. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So if you've been following Fantom over the past several days, you'll notice that it's been quite brutal. It's been quite a bloody last few days with this pretty sizable move to the downside. You know, if we're measuring from the beginning of March, we were at as much as a 50% drawdown just in that starting in the beginning of the month. Now, what's going on here? Well, one of the things that people have been pointing to that kind of catalyzed at least this latter part of this drawdown here was on this day here, where one of the more prominent developers in the Fantom ecosystem, Cronje, announced that they were quitting DeFi development, basically. They're no longer going to be working and pushing forward some of the projects that they had been involved in. And this, freaked out a lot of the markets. People thought that this was going to be the end of the Fantom DeFi ecosystem and everything was going to fall apart. So there's a lot of panic selling, potentially, that was underlying this more recent drawdown and forcing us to such low prices. Now, one thing that's important to note, the Fantom Foundation came out later with a statement to clarify some things because there had been some misconceptions and misinformation about what Andre's departure actually meant for the ecosystem. And in fact, a lot of people had been convinced that a number of projects Andre was involved in, up to 25, would be terminated, would just kind of cease to exist with him leaving. That's not the case. There are independent teams working on each, what the Fantom Foundation clarified, and those projects are not just going to disappear because Andre is exiting the stage. There's also misconceptions about how intimately involved Andre was with just the Fantom network as a whole, just kind of as a core developer. And in reality, he had very little influence in that sort of thing. The Fantom Foundation is a relatively large group. I think it's around 40 developers, and he was not at all a critical member for the innovation and continued health potentially of Fantom. That his leaving is not going to be any fundamental burden on the network, as it were. And so really one possible way of looking at this big capitulation, this big sell-off, was that it was kind of driven by misconceptions and fear and kind of panic more than maybe actual substance. Because one of the things that we can look at, if we go over to DeFi Llama and look at the total value locked on the different chains here, Fantom's still doing pretty well, right? It's still sitting at number 6, still quite good. Still has a ton of protocols on it. This is way more protocols than just what Andre's involved in. Obviously, it's a ton of development that's happened on Fantom, and it still has a good amount of total value locked on it. And then also, interestingly, its market cap to total value locked ratio is the lowest of any of the ones in the top 10. And I've talked about this before on the channel. This is a metric that just basically looks at how over versus undervalued a asset is relative to its total value locked in its ecosystem, and it's something you can just use to compare to other blockchains to see about relative valuation. And the idea is that the lower this ratio is, the more potentially undervalued the token is from a purely DeFi perspective. So for example, if you have other networks that are really kind of thriving based on DeFi like Avalanche, then you can compare these metrics, and then that's just one possible argument you can make for why Fantom's undervalued relative to Avalanche. If these are two layer ones that are really trying to compete in the DeFi space, then the one with the lower market cap to TVL ratio might be offering a more favorable kind of valuation. Now, obviously, market cap to total value locked is kind of a blunt measure because, again, people don't only value these chains by DeFi. There's other use cases, other reasons people would value these. So this is not to say this is the end-all be-all of valuation, but it is certainly one thing that can be useful to keep in mind. The idea being that people are locking up a ton of funds on a given layer one, then that could bring more demand into that ecosystem, more demand for the token, which should make that token more valuable. So if there's a ton of locked up capital, but then the market cap isn't increasing accordingly, that might suggest that there's it's relatively undervalued, and maybe you'd expect that to go up in the future. But again, just one metric should take it in context with a bunch of other things to use when valuing networks. But just something that's interesting to note. And so really from this perspective here, if we're just looking purely at a DeFi perspective, right now there's not glaring alarm bells. And really this drawdown in total value locked was part of that panic selling to some degree. I think in the day following that announcement, Fantom lost like 20% of its total value locked or something like that. Pretty precipitous drawdown. But again, if there's nothing inherently going to happen to the protocols on Fantom because of this, if they're just going to keep going along, the Fantom network's unaffected, it's going to keep going along. Is this really a warranted response? Sure, it's not great that such a prolific developer is leaving, but if the ecosystem's still going to maintain and there are other people building on it, then what's the problem in some ways? You know, one of the things with these chains is adoption, getting more and more people to start using it, start building on it. Once you've gotten developers onto your platform, sure, maybe they'll leave, they'll go somewhere else. But it also seems reasonable if there's no real good reason for them to stop, they might just stay. And also, you know, as there might be some projects that are gotten hit more than these, and there's opportunity for other people to come in and fill that space. So I don't see Andre leaving as a death blow to Fantom by any degree. I think that Fantom still looks like it's doing just fine. And in some ways, my interpretation of this sell-off was that it was a bit premature, and that people were really just panicking based on the news without maybe taking a step back to think like, well, wait a minute, what does this actually mean for Fantom? And from what I'm seeing, I don't think it means all that much. Particularly, I think the fundamentals of Fantom are just about as strong as they were before Andre leaving. It's basically as strong as they were minus whatever impact you think Andre had. I guess if you think Andre was entirety of Fantom, then, you know, that's bad. I personally don't think that's the case, and I don't think that one person for something as big as Fantom can sink it. And so really what this could end up being is just a discount opportunity. Now, obviously not financial advice. You should form your own opinions of how to navigate this. But that's the one way that I'm looking at it. That when you're seeing Fantom down at $1, when just back in January we were up over $3, you know, certainly it could keep going down, could absolutely happen. We're kind of getting back down to this general kind of support range here that we bounced off, had resistance here, didn't quite get to it there, but then support here, coming back and retesting it here. We've caught a bounce now. I don't know, just looking at it for me personally, I would not be betting too confidently on Fantom continuing to go down here. But again, that's just me. Short-term predictions obviously are also a little bit questionable. Now, another metric that we can look at is the upside downside potential indicator, our risk indicator here on the channel, which quantifies risk. So it's essentially looking at when the upside potential is quite low, downside potential is quite high. That would be at a score of, in these red zones, a higher score, so 5 being kind of the exhaustion of upside and maximum downside potential. And then the inverse being -5, so that would be when the downside potential is quite low, upside potential is quite high. What we can see is that on the long-term UDPI, so this is the version that cares about moves that play out over kind of months to years. We have 2 other time frames that I'll talk about in a minute. You can see that really Fantom, ever since the summer of 21, had been playing around kind of these zones. And what that meant is that Fantom was spending an awful lot of time realizing realistic upside potential, not a whole lot of time going back down and realizing its more realistic downside potential. And Fantom has actually been holding up quite well relative to a lot of other assets out there. You know, Fantom was kind of one of the rare assets to really do well in January and show a lot of strength. I think Cosmos did well during that time, and potentially also Luna, if I'm remembering correctly. But there weren't very many altcoins that are doing especially well in January of 2020, or excuse me, of 2022. Fantom was one of the kind of outliers. And again, in my opinion, part of the reason for this is all the usage of it in DeFi, all the demand that brings, all the value that's been locked over on those protocols. And obviously, you know, Andre leaving kind of took a blow to that ecosystem. But again, if that ecosystem's robust and it's going to be able to recover in relatively short order, then I don't see any reason why there should be continued sell pressure from that particular reason. So, you know, it's possible that all the people who are going to panic sell that news have already sold. And that has kind of been priced in at this point. But again, you know, we'll have to wait and see. We look over at the raw output of the long-term UDPI. So this is just the output over time. And you'll see we're broke down below -1. And this is remarkable, again, because this is the lowest risk we've been ever since the summer. Now, obviously, it's higher than the summer was, but it is still the lowest risk we have seen since the summer. You know, and we saw how much Fantom was able to pump just off of this reversal, going back up to test its all-time high again. One thing that's possible is that if we catch a bounce, especially if the broader crypto market were to get more bullish, obviously all of this is caveated based on what the broader market's doing. The broader market dumps, Fantom's going along with it no matter what the reason. It's gonna go down with the market, no matter what, probably. But assuming that the rest of the market, is able to maybe regain some bullish footing, or at very least just kind of chill out, certainly catching a bottom here wouldn't be shocking, in my opinion. Now, again, I'm not going to make any firm short-term predictions because that's a very dangerous game to play. You're generally going to be wrong doing that. So what I'll say is the strongest statement I'll make is it would not surprise me if this kind of panic selling gets bought up by a lot of opportunistic investors and then pushes price back up. That certainly seems plausible to me. And if we look at the different time frames of the UDPI, these are the lowest risk that these have been in quite a while. Fantom, if you've been following the channel and just following kind of its risk levels as we've been going through the last few months, Fantom's been one of the kind of outliers, kind of hanging out in its higher levels of UDPI, suggesting, again, that it had been realizing a lot of its realistic upside potential and hadn't really been realizing its realistic downside potential. So now it is starting to realize some of that realistic downside potential. But again, given the strength it had been showing, there's no guarantee it has to keep going down to some of these levels. Now, again, the caveat, as I mentioned before, is that Fantom is an altcoin. Altcoins are the riskier end of the crypto space. So if we see a broader market sell-off, or if the stock market were to take a massive correction or something like that were to happen, then Fantom's not going to be shielded from that. So that just goes without saying for any altcoin. I don't think that's specific to Fantom. Obviously, it's going to do well by the grace of the broader market. But assuming all that, all that being equal, if that doesn't happen, then Fantom, again, has shown its ability to be strong recently. Would not shock me if people step in to buy this dip, especially because it kind of feels a little bit artificial to some degree. Fantom hadn't been going crazy or parabolic right before that. And so there's nothing to say that Fantom, from any kind of more structural reason, had to capitulate all the way down or has to keep on capitulating. Now, who knows? Again, we'll have to wait and see what happens. If we flip back to the price chart, we did, catch a slight bounce yesterday, a 10% candle to the upside, or technically earlier today, just the candle that ended today. 10% move back to the upside. Now, that's not to say we can't keep moving back down, but I again will say that I will not be shocked if this is the bottom, especially if the broader market remains bullish. I think this capitulation could very easily get bought back up. But again, not trying to make any strong short-term predictions here. Really, with crypto, anything can happen. But really, the point I wanted to make with this video is that from a fundamental standpoint, I don't really see things having changed all that much with Fantom. And so I think all the fear that got injected by this one isolated event of Andre leaving the space maybe provoked more panic than was deserved. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. And remember, with UDPI, we're all going to make it.